last video today, part D.3, session management. In this part, I will give you the background theory. The things that work behind the scene. So you cannot see what happened there, but we need this background to understand the whole technology. Later, we will learn how to use it. To use it, it's relatively simple, just a few lines. But to understand the background, it is very abstract because we cannot see those things. We cannot see what happened behind the scene. We can only imagine that part. So let's start. All right. First, I may like to recall HTTP communication, request response communication. So here we're talking about HTTP. HTTP protocol by default, we know HTTP is stateless protocol. Stateless protocol. It means it does not store the user's state information. State, any data related to that particular user, so we call it state information. HTTP protocol does not store it. The reason I explained last time, because in order to store the user's state information, you need more resource in memory, in main memory. But most of the time, in typical web applications, most of the time, you do not need to use the user's state information. Most of the time. So here, I use some approximate number. So 90% of the time, stateless is fine. Okay? Because people usually do not need user state information for some special features. But a small portion, very small portion, then we need the stateful property. The state information of the users need to be used to support some special features. All right. So for that reason, then if you make the HTTP protocol stateless, then it is more efficient. Less resource by default, so do not use extra resource. Use the minimum resource to do the communication. But only for very small portion, 10%, approximately 10%. Here just some, some number. Now, it may not be really this number, just give you the idea, the concept. For some very small portion, then we need to spend more resource to maintain users' state information. So that's the background. So now we need to do this part. So we need to use this new technologies, the session management, to do that 10%. All right. So let's learn that part. How to store the conversational state across multiple requests for a client. Online shopping. So you place some items in your shopping cart. Okay, drop some items in the shopping cart. So you need to store that state. That's the state information. You need to store that state information for a while. Sometimes even for, in Amazon, you even store for a long time, right? Probably sometimes they may use the database to store. So not the session to store. Sessions for temporary storage, because each session there is a expiration period. There is an expiration period. After certain period of time, it expires automatically. Yeah, but for sometimes for the shopping cart items, so you put in a online shopping website, they allow you to store for a very, very long time. In that case, they can use database to store the items in the shopping cart. Yeah. So here we do not go that far. Yeah. So we just want to look at this session management topic. Yeah. All right. The HE protocol uses stateless connections. Yeah. So that means we cannot use HE protocol directly. We need to use some extra technology on top of HTTP protocol. Yeah, extra part. Yeah, still attached to HTTP protocol, but we need to add that extra part. Yeah. So you will see that extra part. The web server does not maintain contextual information by a client automatically. Yeah. So that means by default, it does not maintain that information. Yeah. So you need to request it. If you need to store that contextual information, you need to request extra resource for it. Otherwise, you won't get it. Yeah. Because it's pretty expensive. Yeah. You need to request it. Yeah. Idea. So let me describe the idea behind this technology. Yeah. Each client needs a unique session ID. How do you associate the state information to a particular user? So you need a unique session ID. Yeah. So that's this concept. Each user has that. So the session ID will be generated by the server. Yeah. But after it is generated, then the client needs to carry that session ID. Yeah. How? Yeah, let's see. Yeah. The session ID is stored on the client machine. Yeah. Has to be stored on the client machine. Yeah. Otherwise, how do you attach the session ID to that particular client? Yeah. Because it is stored right in the client machine. So yeah, with that unique ID, yeah. But definitely there is another copy in the server, right? So here, one copy of the session ID is attached to the client machine. Another copy, because you need to match, right? So another, session ID copy is stored in the server's machine, main memory. Yeah. So we will see that. Yeah. The client sends the session ID back to the server to identify the session object. So here, the server, inside the server needs to create a session object to store the user's state information. Okay, so the user visits this website, so a lot of information needs to be stored. Where to store them? A session object, right? Yeah, in main memory. Yeah. So this session object contains that session ID. Yeah. So if I draw a diagram, right? Suppose this is the session object. Yeah. All right. Yeah. And this one has that unique session ID with it. Okay. Yeah. It occupies the memory resource, yeah, certain amount of memory inside the server. Okay. Server main memory. Okay. Yeah. Main memory. memory of the server. All right, yeah. Then client, suppose this is a client. And the session ID, okay, a copy of session ID. How to store, we will discuss that later. Here, you just assume somewhere in the client machine, the session ID is stored, okay? Equal. So they are equal, okay? Yeah. All right. This copy, that copy, equal. So they can match. Yeah. So then we can use the session ID to identify, oh, this state information is for this client. Yeah. Yeah. The right person. Yeah. All right. But when client sends session ID back to the server, yeah, because the client needs to send a request, right, to the server. When a client sends a request, it needs to carry the session ID inside the HTTP request. Carry that session ID in the HTTP request. So the server side, you can retrieve. When you retrieve information, you retrieve that session ID from the request. So then you use it to match. So which one corresponds to this particular session ID? So to identify, so this session object is the right one for this particular client. So that's the logic behind this technology. Yeah. All right. Next. The session object is stored on the server, yeah, main memory of the server, okay, yeah. Next, use a session ID to identify a user, yeah. So from our diagram, you can see how to identify, right? Yeah, just compare two copies. If they match, that's the right one, right? Yeah, yeah. All right, next. To start, a browser requests a JSP or servlet from the web browser. Yeah, the request JSP or servlet, because only JSP servlet they can handle. They can use session management feature. Only JSP servlet can do session management feature. Java Beans cannot. Okay, so here you can see we do not mention the Java Beans. Okay, Java Beans cannot manage sessions. Okay, that's not support. So now here you can understand why we do not call Java Bean as web component. Okay, so it's quite different. It's quite different from JSP servlet. JSP servlet, you can handle session object, but Java Bean cannot. Okay, yeah. All right, yeah, just know that. All right, so request JSP or servlet from a web server, which passes the request to the servlet engine. Yeah. All right, servlet engine. Then the servlet engine checks if the request includes an ID for the Java session. Yeah. Here I want to give you a little more specific information. Request, yeah. This request we know HTTP request, right? Yeah. Still HTTP request. Yeah. Not a different type of request. Includes that session ID. But how does it include session ID? Right? Yeah. So that part. Headers. HTTP headers. Remember HTTP headers. HTTP headers, we can store that information, session ID information. Yeah. Later we will see the cookies. Yeah. Cookies, and there's another way. Yeah. Because the cookie is the main way to store it, but there is another way. Yeah. Or we can say it this way: the cookie way, the primary way, okay, to store the session ID. and there is a secondary way. Yeah. URL rewriting way, the second way. So we will discuss that part later. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So here, we just know the session ID is stored in the HTTP request headers. Okay. So in the server, we can retrieve the session ID from certain request header and use it to compare with the copy. Yeah, you can do the search, inside the part in the main memory for this particular web application. Try to match which session object corresponds to this user, this session ID. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then, after that, so if not, right? Yeah, because you try to compare search, yeah, but you may not find it, right? Yeah, because at the beginning, the first time it sent that request, there is no session object, so you cannot find that session ID. So if not, the servlet engine creates a session object and assigns an ID to that session object. So the first time it will create a new session object, yeah, and there is ID, so assign it to, send it back. Now, the first time, yeah. But the first time, remember, the client needs to, yeah, so not client, yeah. So this JSP, that servlet need to request it. How to request? We will learn that part later. Okay, so that's another part, the programming part. So this video, we do not do the programming part. We just learn the background theory. But we will have another part. We will do the programming part. Yeah. So, all right. So you need to request it. So then when this JSP or that server requests for a session, okay, so then the session object is created. Yeah, session ID, stored, all those things happen. Yeah. Then the session object is used to store the data. That's obvious. Yeah. Yeah. So we don't need to explain. Yeah, that's obvious, right? Yeah. From that point on, the web server uses the session ID to relay each browser's request. Yeah, it's embedded in the browser request. Yeah. So in our diagram, so here, to relate to the session object. Matching? Yeah. So we can see that. Yeah. All right. Then, next, procedure for using session. Yeah. So this part, so basically it's like a summary, right? Yeah. So the previous screen, slide, so we have a lot of things. So here we just we do summary. So some items may be repeated, yeah, but it's possible you will get something new. Yeah. A client starts a request to a web application. The first point, the first step. Yeah. So we try to go through step by step of the whole procedure. Yeah. Second step, the web application requires a session for a particular feature. Yeah. The client cannot require. Okay. The client cannot require because the client is the user. The user cannot control anything. The user can do only send a request. That's it. The user just sends a request. But the web application, the designer, so when they use some special feature, this feature the designer make the decision to use session. So that's why the web application requires a session for a particular feature. So that's the designer's job, the architect's job. Okay? Yeah. The container generates a unique session ID and sends it back to the client with the response. Response has a header, right? Yeah. So you store that in the response, one of the response headers, somewhere, Yeah. The cookie way, we know the cookie way, store somewhere. Yeah. Just find a special way to store that session ID and send it back. Yeah. All right. The container creates a session in the memory. Now, a block of memory space must be allocated to that session object in the main memory. So that's why we say, to use that feature, there is some cost you need to pay. Yeah. There is some significant cost for the feature using session. Yeah. All right. The client sends back the session ID with each subsequent request. Yeah. The next time, you already store session ID, inside some special locations in the client machine. The next time when you send a request to the same server, so you will carry that session ID to go there. Yeah. And to the same domain. Yeah, here. The session ID is associated with the same domain. If you go to the different domain, then you do not carry that session ID. Right? Yeah, different domain. So it has to attach to certain domain. Here you can see, try to imagine. All these features, all these special data, session IDs data, has to be associated with domain. Okay? Yeah. Then the container associates the session with the request through the ID. Yeah. So in our diagram, so we can see that. Okay. Yeah. So retrieve from the request header. Yeah. Then try to match. So if you get a match, so then you can get that. So then you do the remaining features. Yeah. All right. Session tracking implementation. Then we need to talk about implementation. How to implement this idea. Yeah. So in our discussion before, that's just like an idea, right? Yeah. We want to do these things. Yeah. But how do we do these things? Yeah. We need to look at the implementation. So I mentioned that cookie. Yeah. So here we will go to that kind of details. By default, the servlet API uses a cookie. Yeah. So later I will. Yeah. I think you may heard of cookies, right? You may heard of cookies. Yeah. But you may like to get more information about cookies. Yeah. So if at some point I will talk about cookies. Yeah. But I may like to leave a little later part. Yeah. Little later part. At some point, I want to give you this part of knowledge. Cookies. Yeah. All right. This is an extension of the HTTP protocol. Yeah. Extension, extra part. HTTP protocol, still using HTTP protocol. Yeah. But as I said before, we store the cookies in a header. Yeah. HTTP header part. Yeah. That part. Yeah. Then when the next request is made, this cookie is added to the request. Okay, yeah. Right, yeah. Added to the request. How? Header, yeah. So here it does not mention the HTTP header, but it goes to one of the special header. Yes, all right. The cookies could be disabled. Yeah. So the client they can go to the browser setting to disable cookies. Yeah. Sometimes the users, so they do not want to use cookies. Yeah. So they do not feel comfortable to use cookies. Yeah. So they may disable in the setting of the browser. If that happens, then second method should be used, called URL rewriting is an option. URL rewriting, yeah. So the servlet API provides a way to rewrite the URL. Here you can see there is a string. The session ID string will be attached to the URL part. So that part, without cookie supported, you can still use the URL rewriting because that's the part of the URL attached at the end of the URL string. Yeah. Okay. So it includes the session ID. And you can see sometimes, yeah, if you visit some websites, sometimes you can see that session ID equals a string. You can see that thing. J, yeah, it's called a J session ID. Java, right? Java. So it just uses J session ID. Sometimes you can see that parameter in the URL. Yeah, next time when you see it, that's the URL rewriting thing. Yeah. Yeah. So this is known as URL encoding. Yeah. You encode session ID into the URL part. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. But the cookie way, most of the time the cookie way is used. Yeah. Only when it is disabled, you have to use this way. Otherwise, the session feature won't work. Yeah. So you don't want that happen, right? Yeah. So the second way also important. Yeah. All right. So we finished this part. Yeah. So the next part, I like to still first do the comprehension questions and also do a little bit theory. Yeah, we need to keep going. Yeah, although a little slower. Yeah, but we need to make some progress. Yeah. All right. Okay, so let's stop here. Yeah.